so kompliziert geht die Sache kaputt. Also ehrlich gesagt, ich weiß auch noch nicht so genau, was da nicht funktioniert. Egal. Viele Menschen kümmern sich darum. Herzlich willkommen hier in Hamburg. Schön, dass ihr da seid. Wir freuen uns auf euch. Dass ihr den Frieden dieses Ortes, die Freude, den Spirit dieses Ortes hier spüren könnt, möge euch das ansprechen. Die Herrnhuter Brudergemeinde ist hier in Hamburg entstanden aus Menschen, die hergekommen sind, alles hinter sich gelassen haben, um hier frei ihren Glauben leben zu können. Und das Wichtigste für sie war damals, eine Gemeinschaft bilden zu können. Gemeinschaft ist also ganz wichtig für unsere Familie. Und ich bin so froh, dass ihr alle hergekommen seid zu uns dieses Wochenende. Und wir hoffen sehr, dass viel Gutes passieren wird beim Zuhören, beim Reden, in den Kaffeepausen. In den Kaffeepausen passiert doch ohnehin immer das Beste, oder? Und ich hoffe, dass ihr alle bereichert nach Hause fahren könnt. Herzlich willkommen, eine wunderbare Konferenz. Ich habe noch nicht alle begrüßt, deshalb tue ich das jetzt. Antje wird euch gleich noch offiziell begrüßen. Aber ich möchte auch alle zugeschalteten Menschen herzlich begrüßen. Ich heiße Juliane, ich bin die Generalsekretärin von Church in Peace. Zwei technische Fragen. Können alle alles hören und verstehen? Wenn nicht, bitte aufstehen oder melden. Wunderbar, sehr gut.
How are you feeling today?
Und wie fühlt ihr euch heute?
How are you?
Wie geht's euch?
Okay.
So
That is really good to hear.
Sehr schön, das freut mich.
If you do not feel fine at some point, or if you just want to have anybody to talk, I want to have this known before. We have an awareness team, and all of you with the red ends, all of you who volunteered to be part of the awareness team, can stand up.
Könnt ihr mal aufstehen, wie ihr euch freiwillig bereit erklärt habt, als Ansprechpartnerin zu fungieren für Menschen, die Redebedarf haben.
That have volunteered to pretty much always be there for you to talk or address any problems.
Für euch da. Wenn es Probleme gibt,
Thank you so much. And I will also say thank you at the end, but I already want to say thank you to our wonderful interpreter at the back of the room. I just had to remind myself to speak a little more slowly. So also to everybody who at some point switched up the microphone.
Egal, aber alle anderen, die dieses Wochenende ins Mikrofon sprechen, sind herzlich gebeten, möglichst langsam und verständlich zu sprechen. So, und dann noch zwei Dinge. Ich habe gerade zwei Fotos gemacht. Es gibt zumindest eine Person, die offiziell Fotos macht. Etienne, schießt mal auf. Wunderbar. Wenn jemand Probleme damit hat, also nicht will, dass ein Bild von ihr oder von ihm veröffentlicht wird auf unserer Homepage oder in den sozialen Medien, dann teilt mir das bitte mit.
Dann zu allerletzten, wenn jemand Schwierigkeiten hat.
Ich habe gerade irgendwie 1,5 Stunden Streaming-Probleme gelöst und jetzt verstehe ich. Ja, aber egal. Nochmal zur Papierarbeit. Jule aus Berlin, Jule Lang, steht oben auf.
Thank you. She will do our social media, our Instagram, so it's
Sie ist zuständig für Instagram und die sozialen Medien. Wenn jemand nicht auf Instagram erscheinen möchte, dann wende er sich bitte an Jule. Ich glaube, das ist alles. Eine wunderbare Konferenz und ich gebe jetzt gerne an Antje weiter.
Ich habe die Kanäle, habe ich das nicht angehört.
Das heißt, die deutsche Verdolmetschung sollte lauter sein?
Can I test the English booth? English is on 2. Can you hear English? Does anybody hear English? Good evening, everybody. It's nice that you're here. It's great to be guests here in the middle of Herrnhut with so many people from Church and Peace. It's wonderful that so many people have turned up. Can you hear English? Could somebody put their hand up? It's coming. Okay, thank you very much. Good. Channel 2. So, big thanks to Jill Faucht. We heard from her before for all the arrangements, especially those made with the committee as well. So, we're connected by many ways, actually. There's hardly a meeting when we don't look at the watchwords of the Moravians. And today it is, God says, there's a hope for the future. In the English it says, there's hope for the future, says the Lord. Then, this evening, we will hold to God and tackle the topic of the conference with confidence. Friend, don't be hardened. Don't let yourself be hardened, as the first line of the song goes. And with that, we will resist, be reconciled and transformed, in spite of hard times and hard discourses. But we have very tangible connections with your community, because Marina Mibbs is strongly rooted in it. Our colleague, she's strongly rooted in the Moravian community here. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here ourselves. She made us curious about it and encouraged us to come to Herrnhut and to meet all the people. And you can see how many have turned up out of curiosity, giving her credit for that. At this point, a big thank you to Marina, our Executive Secretary, and to Juliana Pruford, our General Secretary, for all their hard work. And a big thank you to the colleagues from the board who obliged me with so many different meetings to make arrangements. And we hope we've prepared for this conference well. For Elizabeth Fraser and myself, it's the 15th time. Thank you to the 4 interpreters again, Beatrice, Marie-Noël, Christina and Elaine. It's a lot louder now, that's good. Thank you to Elizabeth Fraser, who's accompanied me for 15 years. For the two of us, it's our last conference that we have co-planned and co-moderated. And what a wealth of people, topics, places, and networks we've encountered. 2 years ago, we met in the Netherlands, in Barlo, and conferred on the topic of racism in the church, a common topic with the Moravians. And we were impressed at the many initiatives that the Dutch and European Moravians reported to us. And perhaps I'd like to mention another connection with the Moravian community here. The Moravians don't need to be told, but I do have to tell the other members of Church and Peace how important Bishop Johann Amos Comenius was, the last bishop of the Bohemian branch of the Moravian Church. He lived from 1592 to 1670. And following the Reformation theology and education of Luther and Melanchthon, Comenius laid the foundations for an ecumenical theology and a modern peace pedagogy based on Christian foundations. He personally experienced the 30 Years' War, the unleashed violence, destruction, displacement, and exile, and made proposals to settle wars and set up a worldwide peace order. There'd be a lot we could tell you about him. But just one more thing. At the age of 75, he wrote an appeal called Angelus Pazis, Angel of Peace. England and the Netherlands at the time were in a brutal sea war for the second time, and they were fighting for dominance over the colonies, trade journeys, trade routes, and trade merchandise. Now, Angelus Pazis, he came up with a draft for the two delegations to discuss on two occasions of negotiation to bring the end to a war. Will bring the end to the war. Comenius' great chance was that he was an ideal mediator. He was a mediator who was neutral. He was only a small-scale player who had the opportunity of initiating the discussion. Still, he made a pragmatic proposal and came up with a compromise peace so that the power spheres could be divided up as justly and agreeably as possible. He criticized a lot of what went on in exploitation of the colonies as pure materialism, because it all led to just an accumulation of luxury goods in Europe, he said. At the same time, he developed a vision of a far more wide-reaching world peace. We have to give up the idea of ruling the seas, but just it's not a matter of a few people accumulating great wealth, but above all for everybody being able to eat, drink, clothe themselves and praise the Lord on their own in freedom. And later he wrote, it won't stop unless we stop realizing that you can't heal scabies by scratching, as Plato himself said. So wars do not end through wars, nor arguments through arguments, nor persecution through persecution. All of this has to be transformed into its opposite, end of quote. So the transformation of destructive passions, individual and political, into human passion is the task of Comenius' education, the way he sees it. And so he became the founder of a lifelong learning, a peace pedagogy. And UNESCO refers to him even now. UNESCO says, we hope that every person will be led to perfection, whether you are poor or rich, Christian or Muslim, black or white, male or female, born or unborn. Comenius was a diplomat of peace and the founder of a pedagogy that enabled peace. And that's the basis of schools and institutes founded since then in his spirit, here in Herrnhut as well. So I think that we were thinking of that when we invited the churches to the worldwide ecumenical pilgrimage for justice, reconciliation, and unity on behalf of the World Council of Churches in 2022. I think that Comenius would be very close to us in the network of peace churches, the peace workers, the education initiatives for nonviolent conflict transformation. So this conference is also a stopover on that very pilgrimage. This time here in the eastern part of Germany, we're almost at the Czech border. And amongst us we have people who have lived long, in fact lived before 1990, their whole lives beyond the border of East and West, the Iron Curtain, as we used to call it. And we have invited speakers. for a path of Christian witness against the arguments of self-destructive security concepts. We can no longer bear the silence. Let us make our confession unmistakable. Berlin, Pankow, October 24, 1981. Or we can say October 24th, Herrenhut. The church, the issue of peace was a major challenge of public responsibility after World War II. In 1965, the churches said something that the Protestant Church in West Germany never confirmed. The churches in East Germany said conscientious objection is the clearest testimony to Christian service for peace. For years, the Protestant churches in the GDR had been concerned with issues of peace, the dismantling of enemy stereotypes, and nonviolent conflict resolution. In the revolutionary autumn of 1989, Christians were able to draw on this during the peaceful revolution. The fact that the revolution remained peaceful defies monocausal explanations, as do all historical processes and events. The courageous shipyard workers from Gdansk, the founding of the Solidarność trade union in Poland, the new policies of Mikhail Gorbachev, and the revolutions in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia were the prerequisites for the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. When rain falls, leaves fall, the wall did not fall. It was brought to a fall. Our language is not very clear in that respect. We shouldn't talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall any longer. It was broken down. Where did people gather in the autumn of 1989 before they took to the streets to demonstrate? They went to church. Many of them, most of them, had never seen the inside of a church before, and now they sat freezing with the hard pews with hundreds of others and sang Dona nobis pacem. And before the people took to the streets, they lit their candles from the altar candles. The state authorities were there with their water cannons to not use any violence, and the other followed suit. But could it not be that the well-founded theological engagement with questions of peace in the church communities contributed to the revolution being a peaceful one? Could it be that the praying and singing, the silence and listening reached people, even though many of them were not Christians? Could it be that the spirit of the intentions of the intercessory prayers was carried out onto the streets, where the cold wind of state power was blowing? At least for one side, the rule was no violence. What happened on the streets is a miracle to me, and it is still today. For when have we Germans ever succeeded in a revolution without bloodshed, without war and victory and the humiliation of other peoples and nations? It's a miracle of biblical proportions, says the theologian in me. It was the multifactorial interplay of foreign and domestic political constellations, says the political scientist in me. Both are true, says the experience in me. And if we ask ourselves what any of these approaches still hold true, I invite you to listen to these texts and examine for yourselves what relevance they might have for us today. In 1978, socialist defense education was introduced as a regular school subject in the GDR, and this was sharply criticized by the Protestant churches. It was criticized sharply by Protestant churches. I quote, and I ask you to read this text with the background of 2025. The Gospel's call for peace requires churches and every individual Christian to soberly examine what reduces tensions in the current world situation, what promotes trust, and what serves peace. Violence as a means of conflict resolution is self-destructive in a world full of weapons. We must begin to practice non-violent forms of dispute resolutions. We must begin to pursue paths to security that make not only us, but also others safer. Thinking in terms of the clichés of friend and foe makes it impossible to assume joint responsibility for the world. That's what the churches said in 1978. In March 1982, the Protestant churches in the GDR published a study for congregations that dealt with the fundamental questions of the political effectiveness of Christian peace service. Self-understanding had become necessary due to the accusations by the SED, the ruling party, that the Protestant churches were destabilizing the GDR with pacifist ideas. It stated renunciation of violence is becoming a requirement of political reason. It's not pacifism that calls into question the foundations of previous peace and security policy in Europe, but rather the increasingly destabilized system of military peacekeeping, which is punishing life to the limits of its political capacity and thus provoking the question of a new security policy. That was in 1982. The statement on socialist military training and the pacifism paper were more internal church communication process, and that changed. We went onto the streets. This changed in 1982 with the symbol swords into plowshares. That's the sculpture that you find in front of the United Nations building. It was donated to the United Nations in 1959 by the Soviet Union, and we said, okay, what the Soviet Union gives to the United Nations cannot be wrong in the GDR. But we were mistaken. There was a lot of repression. Schoolgirls were expelled from schools, students from universities. Most people were wearing the patch. Some people were refused entrance into the university, for instance. But not only the fact that the atheist Soviet Union gave this symbol to the United Nations. You all know the biblical text from the book of Micah. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And on the base of the sculpture, you can see the engravement, we shall beat our swords into plowshares. This is a very interesting commitment and a deviation from the biblical text. We shall beat our swords into plowshares. Very interesting. The young people who wore the patch were repressed, and the Synod in Magdeburg said in 1982, those who wear the symbol want to express their hope for peace, which will be achieved not through more weapons, but through fewer weapons, not through armament, but through disarmament, not through preparation for the worst-case scenario, but by preparing for the best-case scenario, and to respond with a clear preference for non-violent means. And now I would like to speak about the Ecumenical Assembly, which took place in the spring of 1989 in the GDR. A lot of people who participated at the process and went to the Ecumenical Assembly, ministers, they became ministers and Secretary of States afterwards, but they also founded political parties after the revolution in the autumn of 1989. You can, and they copied the declaration from the Ecumenical Assembly. It's great to see how political parties copied declarations of the Ecumenical Assembly.
Und das heißt, wir haben erkannt, der biblische Ruf zur Umkehr trifft uns heute neu. Unsere Arbeit in der ökumenischen Versammlung
It was clear that the biblical call to repentance is relevant to us today. We are committed to our primary obligation to create justice for all disadvantaged and oppressed people. We commit ourselves to our primary obligation to serve peace through non-violent means, and we commit ourselves to our primary obligation to protect and promote life on this earth. And Chapter 6, entitled Aspects of Peace Education, emphasizes prejudices and enemy stereotypes that serve primarily to assign blame. In 1987, the Protestant churches in the GDR finally passed a resolution that represented the culmination of theological criticisms of the system of deterrence. They said, in obedience to the triune God, we have expressed our rejection of the spirit, logic, and practice of deterrence. The term rejection is a very interesting term. It reminds Christians of the baptismal confession of the early church with its public rejection of Satan.
Dahinter steht die Argumentation, im Bekennen vor Gott entziehen wir dem System der atomaren Abschreckung die Legitimation. Es war der Versuch, den Rahmen des politisch Möglichen aufzubrechen und den Unmöglichen des Glaubens.
Break down the framework of what was politically possible and confront it with the impossible demands of faith. Dear friends, today in times of armament, war rhetoric, and enemy stereotypes, we ask ourselves, can the theological orientation of the peace work of the churches in the GDR still be a resource for public peace discourse and action by the church today under the umbrella of a reunified EKD, a pious wish, a utopia, an illusion, a remnant, or a real resource? The examples presented show how the Protestant churches in the GDR attempted to raise awareness of the risks and dilemmas of enemy stereotyping, deterrence with weapons of mass destructions, and a one-sided approach to security, with the help of a theologically based peace ethic in their practical peace work. In 1989, only a quarter of the population in the GDR identified as Protestant Christians, making them a minority, and yet, much to the annoyance of the state, they were systemically relevant. The state always said, we have to make sure that the churches become real churches again, do pastoral work, that is. And Julia Knöckler, the president of the Bundestag, says today that churches should do their church job. That's more or less the same. And it shows the churches how systemically relevant they still are. We should be happy about Mrs. Klöckner's declaration. We learned that nonviolence is not a weakness, but a strength. What helped them? What helped us? Not to become hardened, not to become bitter, not to be frightened, not to get involved. A college of voices from a peace circle. I published a book with a recollection of voices from a peace circle. The title is Don't Let Yourself Become Hardened.
Einer der bekanntesten Redner im Deutschen Bundestag ist leider schon verstorben und er sagt, keine Gewalt.
No violence was a fundamental principle of the peace movement, and it remains a very important task in our society today. Martin Hoffmann, said, "The most important thing for me was that over the years, a group of people had developed a form of communication that was not about being right, but about the question, what do you have to say about this? What do you want to contribute? Don't let yourself become embittered." We developed a culture of dialogue in which different opinions were accepted. I believe that my time with the Peace Circle helped me understand that even in situations where change seems impossible, it still makes sense to work for change. It has something to do with preserving one's own dignity. Don't let yourself be frightened. When I joined the Peace Circle, I was no longer alone. That is someone who was 16-year-old in those days. She gave an interview and she said that her Christian faith helped her a lot when she was imprisoned in the Soviet Union. I became braver, she said. Use your time. I always asked myself, when are you doing this? For me, it was really my children. I did not want to have done nothing about these nuclear weapons that were aimed at us and could destroy my children's future. That was a terrible thought for me. I did not think so much that we were changing society, but I believed that we were changing ourselves through this work. We don't want to keep it quiet. Green shoots bursting from the branches. We celebrated the Lord's Supper in a very archaic way, perhaps as one imagines it, with a long table in the church and red wine and broken bread, and we talked about it. We celebrated liturgical nights, and I suddenly realized that the church could come alive again. A deep piety sustained me during this time. I had the feeling that I was being held, especially in dangerous situations. I always said that the 11th commandment should be invented, and that it should say, "Thou shalt do no less than is permitted." Dear friends, Christians in the GDR often tried timidly, frequently conforming, and sometimes courageously to find their way in the reality of the GDR. We have seen how biblical traditions and Protestant theology have provided force of language and symbols during times of social upheaval. The call and the stance of no violence was thus fueled by decades of effort to find ways of living well together, both within our own country and with our neighbors, at the height of the Cold War confrontation. Thank you very much for listening.
So now we're going to sing a hymn, or a song, if you call it that. Number one in the hymn book or the song book.
Actually, we shall continue with our buzz groups the whole evening. The group I was in was fascinating, and I had the feeling everybody was enjoying themselves. But now we've got another item on the agenda. I'm going to make a few short points. First of all, I'll introduce myself a bit differently with my relationship to church and peace. And secondly, I got stuck on the topic of reconciliation. And in all, I've got 4 points where I think that we, people, are at risk of hardening. But first of all, something about my life. I was born in the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. Most of my friends went to what they called the building soldiers. Those were people who didn't bear arms. And others were involved in armament. And I was convinced that that was against what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, and against non-violence. Now, after the wall came down in Berlin, I was disappointed. Because the criticism of the military spending wasn't as radical as I expected. It was rather an anti-communist impulse. And that's why this anti-militarism died down. We, young people in the Moravian Church, were sometimes very pleased if we could count our churches amongst the historical peace churches, but unfortunately we couldn't. The Czech brothers or brethren, that is the Reformation that took place in Bohemia, now Czechoslovakia, before Luther, was not non-violent. And my friend Comenius, at the critical points of his own life and the course of the war, had not always rejected war in order to achieve peace. So the Moravians and other churches did, however, succeed in getting permission not to have to bear arms or to do military service. But in the 19th century, nationalism and militarism took over. And that was a mark of pride. And young people quite proud of bearing arms suddenly. A bit more in my life, prepared in that way. My great-uncle Kurt went into the First World War in 1914. He studied theology before. He was very sensitive, for sure, and was enthusiastic about the thunder of cannons that he heard on the horizon. He said that was the most splendid music he'd ever heard in a letter that he wrote. I reread his letters. He was in Normandy, for example, and I was shocked that he was so proud of his Saxon regiment having burnt down some villages there. And he enjoyed that and looking at that, and I thought, that's dreadful. Well, his brother, my grandfather, was in the Second World War and sat with old soldiers after the war in the house of my grandparents and observed the barrier that they'd set up against the Soviet army out in the street, not far from here, near Bautzen. I don't know whether they really had the courage to wave white flags and what would have happened. But today I discuss these things with my brother. I ask him what could help aggressors like Putin, and we don't agree. But I can assure you, I can't even express my own opinion properly. Expect that I won't allow my opinion to be dictated by anyone like Putin. So that was my personal presentation. Now, something about reconciliation and transformation. And the question is the extent to which they have not succeeded between East and West. And I was attracted to the topic of reconciliation because somehow I had the feeling that this word perhaps doesn't even exist to explain the relationship between East and West. Perhaps it's not appropriate. I've got a sketch from Comenius from 1644 on the question of reconciliation. He was very pedagogical. First of all, he defined it, and he said, reconciliation is the return of two or more parties after an insult or after being hurt to their original love. Now, could you say that about East and West? East and West in Germany, divided Germany, developed differently in the past and even now. And while the mutual love, as long as the wall was standing, consisted in returning to the earlier stage of German unity. If that was the case, do you think that should have really happened? It didn't, of course. There was no reunity as it had been before. Very soon there was disappointment, there was hurt and divisions between word and deed, in terms of word and deed, in fact. Names were used like you're an Aussie, you're from the East, you're a Wessie, you're from the West, and so on, with stereotypes attached. And then unemployment happened, hunger, unemployment in the former GDR. East Germany had more unemployment at the beginning, at least. Imbalance of power, if you like, various infrastructures and so on. In terms of the economic situation, everything was unequally divided, and this led to hurt. So this certainly wasn't coming back to the original state of an internally united Germany. So according to Comenius, we should have various members of the family. We should, and several mediators indeed, who have both sides equally see them as friends, and who know them equally well, and they would be good mediators then. Well, I don't know if we're well distributed here in the panel. We seem to be more originally to the east than to the west up here. But one question about Comenius is reconciliation possible at all? If the hurt has been around for so long, has festered, if you like, for all this time. If the main grievance has been there for a long time, then you can say, okay, just let's forget it. And then it's easier to proceed. But you could ask if you actually need reconciliation. Do you need reconciliation if time heals all wounds? But it could be that time only heals wounds imperfectly, and then they could be given and handed on from generation to generation. And precisely then, inequalities will be continued. In my opinion, this is one of the reasons for what I would call the invasion by the East German Monday demonstrators and so on. If you like, the dove of peace as a symbol of a peace-loving East, who knew didn't really love it, but could think of the cracking down on the Prague Spring in 1968. Actually, this means we don't want to fight for your democracy. We're not defending a country that's not ours. And it doesn't bother with us, it doesn't care about us. So I could then say that's a reason why reconciliation still remains necessary. According to Cornelius, just to come back to him, the important thing for mediators is that they love both sides of the conflict and that they have the will and the competence to look into the depths of the conflict, and above all, they have a great deal of stamina. So that was my second point. So what you need for reconciliation. Thirdly, where do I see a risk of hardening, particularly among peacemakers? Don't let yourself be hardened. Instead, you should fight war. You should fight war itself and not the soldiers. So I remember my first peace demonstration in 1990. I was in the 90s in Hessen, around Frankfurt. That was at the time of the Second Gulf War. The small town of Büdingen in that state had an American barracks. And initially, everything was very peaceful. For example, there was a peace march one day with bagpipes. And everything seemed peaceful until they stood in front of the American barracks, and there was a hate-filled scream, so that I ran away. Today I think that sort of thing happens. Like Jesus' disciples, for example, they cut the soldier's ear off when they were trying to seize him in the Garden of Gethsemane. So they showed unexpected potential for aggression, these disciples. So such a thing can happen. Second point, don't let yourself be hardened, so that instead of the war, you combat those who want to achieve peace by other means. I haven't got much more to say about that. We're often in bubbles. We talk amongst ourselves, only to our friends, and then we set up fronts against those who don't agree with us. Now, Jesus was an expert in dialogue, precisely in conversation with his opponents. I don't know Church and Peace all that well, but I can well imagine that you deal with dialogue differently too. I can't think that that would be a great danger for you. Don't let yourself be hardened so that instead of winning the peace, you lose the love of people. Now, working on peace calls for stamina, as I've said, for perseverance, particularly the ability to love. And I see as a danger that from the right standpoint for peace, we despise the masses in view of their spreading readiness to subject themselves to powerful, violent men. I think that's a danger. And finally, and I added that yesterday when I was looking at my notes, don't allow yourself to be hardened so that you lose your empathy. Yesterday I was at a meeting of the Dresden Educational Authority of the government, and what absolutely depressed me was that we're apparently less and less able to feel empathy or express it. There was a woman there who complained, a Russian, that the Russian villages had been ignored since 24, even since 94, reaching back. And it was also said there were Jewish victims of Hamas in the 7th of October attack, and Gaza was mentioned. And thinking of our suffering on their behalf, empathy, the same suffering is experienced by the women in Russia. So let us not be hardened. I was asked to say a blessing.
Mikrofonhalterin. Gott, Ursprung und Vollenderin aller Dinge, segne dich. Gebe Gedeihen dir und Wachstum und Gelingen deinen Hoffnungen. Und behüte dich.
Sorry, let us thrive and grow and succeed in your hope, and protect us in danger and be our refuge in fear. The Lord make his face shine upon you like the sun warms us, and be merciful to us when you are clothed in guilt. May the sun release you from all evil and make you free. God lift